Hey, thanks so much, Jason. Thanks for the introduction. That sounded like a Norwegian pronunciation of Lux, maybe. So I'm really happy to be joining Daisuke today here. He's an artist whose work I've been following for a while now, and so it's a real privilege. Thank you to the Daiwa for inviting me. I'm really conscious that we don't have very much time, actually, so I'm just going to go straight in to start to talk about the works in the exhibition, and then we'll kind of expand outwards from there. So Daisuke, could we start by perhaps talking about the maybe the gestation of these works? Perhaps we could start with All That Goes Before Forget. And perhaps actually you could start by talking about the title.
Oh yeah, the title All That Goes Before Forget come from the first sentence of a short poesis called Enough by Samuel Beckett, and it's not like this work was inspired by this short prose, but while I was working with this film, somehow the thing that I was dealing with to narrate the personal traumatic story, the problematic of narrating, found something common in his text. Samuel Beckett wrote this text, short prose in the French fast, so that, and he always have this like formalistic challenges, and in this case he tried to write, it's like a personal narrative from I sentence, so it's like a first person narration, but because of this linguistic technique he used, the reader is not knowing if the main person is female or male, which I guess is really difficult to do in French. And then after that, he translate that text into English. And then from my understanding, he had a little bit more different challenge, because in English, the gender doesn't really matter. So I think it was something to do with, I forgot what was his challenge, but there was something that formalistically, it was really difficult to have a total image of what is going on in this. It's kind of confessive narration of his text, and I found it really something similar to the film itself, and the title All That Goes Before Forget could understand in a two different way, and so that was also something that I thought it's really fitting with my work.
Could you perhaps kind of could you perhaps talk about maybe the themes of the film? You mentioned PTSD in the kind of text around the work. Could you maybe expand on?
I mean, there's perhaps like two ways of explaining. The first, I was interested in this before this film started, like maybe since 2015 or so. After I read the text called the book called The Body in the Pain by Irene Scary. This book is some sort of analysis about the linguistic agency in the notion of pain. She argued that pain doesn't have like felt experience of pain doesn't have a language, and somehow I was interested in this, the feeling or not feeling, experience which not yet have language, but representation of pain exists all over the media, literature, photography, and so on. And from there, I was interested in also trauma, because the trauma is quite complex thing, but also there's lots of film and literature and documentary that deal with trauma. And I had my grandma, and I think it was 2018. I made an interview with her about her war experience trauma, She told me this story when she was when I was really young, I think perhaps 6 or so, and I really visualized this scene. So I wanted to check like if I kind of like made it into the fiction, or if I remember her story correctly. And of course, there was certain kind of exaggeration in my head, but most interesting thing was that she told me this anecdote. After 50 years of after World War II ended, a local high school had this project to how to say interview all the generation who experienced the war and make a publication. It's some sort of living testimony. And for me, I found that project kind of important because there's lots of these kind of project happens. For instance, the Peace Museum in Hiroshima also have a video archive of individual testimony. But somehow in my grandma case, everyone in that area didn't want to talk about their memory. So in the end, this publication kind of canceled. And so that was my starting point, that if survivor doesn't want to recall the memory, doesn't want to talk about memory, express the violence that happens in the memory, what they want to talk about. And through that, I kind of understood that perhaps the mainly current depiction of trauma focus on what happens in the incident, how they explain what violence is put upon to the victim. But perhaps survivor want to tell more about their surviving, which is like they're still living, so that how they carry the memory and how they still fighting the memory. So all that goes before forget, I kind of consciously take out all the scene that the trauma instance itself, but I only described the build up to the trauma sequence. And perhaps that kind of fit with how everyone with PTSD remember things. They kind of remember more linearly how in their head how this incident happened, but not incident itself, because during the incident they have a flight and the fight response, so that amygdala kicks in and all the details are kind of everywhere and in a way fragmented, but really detailed and strongly connected to the feeling of fear. So that's how filmed.
Yeah. And I wonder if you could say something about this kind of indefinability about time and culture across the film as well. It's happening in place. It's not really, it's obviously happening in different times and places, but there's a certain kind of elliptical quality to that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about.
Yeah, I mean, overall, like my process usually start with really personal, intimate conversation with real persons, like testimony in a sense. So I didn't really curate the connection of each story. I didn't like try to find a story that relate and try to go to the subject. It's more like through my life, these kind of conversations happen, and then there was let's say there was 3 scenes, and the one is kind of like Japanese teenager girl in the bomb shelter, and that is kind of inspired by the story of my grandma. And other one is what is called? It's called Tiskenta. It's War Child. During the German occupation, Nazi occupation in Norway, there was some female have a romantic relationship with the German soldier. And I think it's kind of in Europe, it's kind of international phenomenon. After the Nazi goes back and these women are ashamed and kind of put it away of society. And that kind of shame and punishment goes to the kid of the child. And I happen to know a person who are were kind of grown up as a war child in the institution and adapted to the elder family. And so the story about this young girl, child, in some sort of 1950s aesthetic clothes is the story from there. And other one is the more like contemporary setting in the bathroom, and that is also that is more like collage of mix of my personal experience, but also someone who have experienced let's say domestic abuse or some sort of abuse in the safe place, which is home. And often in these kind of case, bathroom became quite important place because that's the place that the victim or survivor can be alone without having any suspicion from the offender. And often like going out from that safe space is really strong moment. So that's what is in the, that's why I chose the location in the bathroom.
Okay, super. When we met up the other day, you were talking about quite this interesting kind of writing process that you have around kind of like translating, and that just made me think when you were talking about the Samuel Beckett just there about this kind of writing process that you have. I can't remember if you said you write in Japan and then translate, work with somebody else to translate that or something. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that kind of writing process.
Yeah, I think since my education, all art education happened in Norway, I feel like a way of creating narrative or certain abstraction is kind of from the Western art discourse. But at the same time, my English is not like, it's not my mother tongue. So first, when I write, I have like big ideas in the English, and then when I get the writing mode, I write everything in Japanese without thinking about grammar, just like machine gun shoot. And then from there, I translate my Japanese text into English so that I can check how grammatically I can tell this story, or which first point view or third point view, or yeah, kind of to create moment that I can use my text as a material so that I have a different eye on my text. And that's similar to filmmaking process. To I think I never bring someone from production to post-production. It's only me who are kind of in the changeable in the connection, because of course what happens in the filming session is really exciting and engaging and intimate, but at the same time in the editing period, instead of remembering how I felt in the shooting, I need to see what it is in the image, and that's I need editor to kind of switch my mind. So most of the editing process, like first week of editing process, we just watch all the footage without touching anything. Just watch again to see the quality of each takes or each scene.
Super. And the other thing I really noticed about this, well, I mean, really connects both the films, but this attentiveness to gesture as well. I wonder if you could say something about that, maybe particularly like working with actors and this this focus on kind of gesture and hand movements and things like that.
Yeah, this is also I think in the first most perhaps it comes from how I remember the scene in my memory, and also studying a little bit how the memory mechanism in while amygdala is kicked in works. And it is really interesting that when you are in the fight and flight mode, the amygdala try to record everything, surroundings, all the details, so that they can perhaps use it in a later. And so the details and all the small gesture became really important, significant, even though maybe perhaps it's not part of the main course. So I had this image of details, how to somehow describe the scene without showing the overview, but only the details. And of course, if anyone noticed, I studied a little bit of Robert Bruston's the hand pickpockets and all the things. And it was really interesting thing, because let's say within the film, I mean, now it's everything mixed up, so you don't really notice so much. But how I wrote narrative and how I shot, and first, before editing everything, me and the editor set each story in the one chunk, so that it's like 3 chunks, and see if it's gonna work. But then we start noticing that somehow how the time goes in each scene was different, because in the bathroom setting, it's appropriate certain contemporary cinema kind of aesthetic, the close-up and kind of using bokeh and changing the focus and the camera pans. And it's I will say, like, and also try to mimic certain real time in a contemporary sense. But when I see the footage from the War Child stories, then I noticed everything was kind of one tempo off. So it's one action show, one action show. And there's something also, I think something noticed perhaps in common in the film in the 60s or 50s, that there's certain dramaturgy that I don't know it came from, but there's different tempo of action. Sometimes in the contemporary time, the time goes like this, but in the, let's say, the pickpocket scene, it feels like it goes this, and then show from other angle and go this, show from other angle, go this. And I think that was interesting. I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's really great. And in terms of, perhaps another characteristic of both the films is a certain kind of coolness and distance as well. And I wonder if perhaps you could talk about that kind of intention, or maybe like the affective intention of of the film.
Can you repeat?
Yeah. Thinking about this kind of the coolness and distance of this film, talking about trauma. I just wonder what you were thinking in terms of about the intention of the affect of the film for people viewing it.
I don't know how to answer that question, because I think like the coolness and distance is something more like interpretation of the scene. And when I make film, I don't really try to think from how to interpret. It's more like what image does as a reason, and how I remember scene and how it comes back. Coldness and distance. Where did you find it?
No, I meant more. Not coldness, like just a coolness, I guess. Like I like a certain. Yeah, I mean, you're right. Maybe maybe this is just my experience of it. Yeah, just a certain kind of. I said. I mean, and definitely with false weight as well. A certain kind of like distance. Like a certain observed, distance.
I guess that's more like, since I like to observe things,
Fair enough.
But I mean, with all that goes before forget, one thing is how the image kind of holds up, but also another thing is the voiceover, right? Voiceover sets certain premise of the film. And since voiceover kind of talks everything in the kind of, they talk about experience that the experience of remembering and flashback, they talk in, she talks in the present tense, but often the past, actually what we see in the image is about past. And perhaps
Yeah.
that's the kind of distance that is created. And I was interested in this, let's call the substance, let's say if the subject is going to experience something violent, then usually film builds up the suspense. And you won't engage, perhaps like the film director wants viewer to engage in the present time, not knowing what's going to happen. But at the same time, I wanted to somehow, I was more interested in fear of presence time, remembering that moment and how flashback could kick in. So the past itself is already happened. So the subject or viewer is not so afraid of what happens in the scene, but perhaps subject are more suspended of building fear towards how they would feel about that past. If it that
Yeah. Yeah, no, that does make sense. And I suppose my other kind of sense of coolness is coming from maybe the aesthetic of the film as well. It feels like there's a certain kind of mutedness to the color, things like that. And is that also about this kind of this kind of sense of kind of distance of time and things?
When it's come to other film, A False Weight, I really wanted to go more like pastel color, the muted color, so that it's became more like a flat image and somehow something a little bit daydreaming feeling. But when it's come to All That Goes Before Forget, during the color correction session, we tried to have a little bit more saturation and perhaps a bit more dark. So yeah, but maybe it's something to do with light in Norway. The,
Yeah,
the sunlight in Norway is really dry, not
yeah,
cold and dry. It's not like LA light that everything kind of like flat
ah,
and kind of popped up. It's everything is a bit more muted. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. Right. Perhaps we could go on to talk about the false weight now. Um, could you maybe talk a little bit about the kind of gestation of that project, how it kind of started?
Before this false weight, I made the documentary called Meeting Uncle Yuji. So I really like working in the kind of documentary way. And when I get permission to new work from Laura Harman about how we understand architecture in the new way, I was thinking to make the documentary about my father, because it was 2017 and it was right after my father got diagnosed with PSP, which was similar to Parkinson's disease, basically brain disease that slowly you start losing the cell of the brain, and in his disease he loses mobility and also sense of honor. And he was he had his whole life as a building engineer and architect, so he had this really Dekantian mind control body type of way of thinking. Everything is supposed to be rational and effective. So after he retired, he started doing bodybuilding, and he controlled everyday routine, diet, how to train, everything to reach the idealistic body in a sense. But after he started feeling the symptom of PSP, he couldn't really make sense of it, because what happened is the brain is not sending signal in the way that he wants to send. And that from that place, he really didn't know how to describe the mechanism. So I was thinking to make a documentary about him talking about that, exactly the lack of language, and perhaps it's kind of connected to what I was interested in at the moment, which is the lack of language in the linguist, pain. And then, but at the same time, he didn't want to be filmed when he's sick, but he was okay to show his footage when he was doing bodybuilding. So that was a premise. So I wanted to, I needed someone or something to kind of show his presence, and that's why I asked Buto dancer Toru Iwashita to reenact my father's everyday routine, so that we can have this conversation. So the scenes or the footage that you're seeing in the film is more like, I came out as more like a bait, so that we can have a conversation between Toru and my father. And so the Toru have a, let's say, practice of Buto dance, but also he's, I think, more identify himself as an improvisation dancer. So he had been doing improvisation session with patient in the hospital since 1980s. So I thought perhaps Toru can communicate with my father not through the language my father has, which is more like sports type scientific way, but somehow bodily, some sort of language that Buto practice. And so I hired my father as an acting director, and we start shooting, while we always have a second camera kind of filming the documentary scene. And after all the filming done, and there's so many, like it was, I think, 10 days session, and we actually filmed in my parents' apartment, even though I was planning to book similar apartment, because it was really tricky to move him around. So in the end, we decided that, well, my parents asked, can you film it at home? And that was kind of also like a challenging. We come, let's say 8 in the morning, and set up all the lighting and everything, clean up so that it looks like scene. And then we shoot whole day. And then around 6, we have to take down everything and make it so that my parents can have a normal day. So it was a really intense, but also engaging week. So there was so many footage about, let's say, in the documentary way, like a family reunion, emotional moment, the friendship between Toru and the father. But in the end, I had to cut everything out, because I found that the scene that they made, in a way they made together, had a really beautiful quality. And whenever I tried to break the fourth wall by showing some footage of my father and Toru talking, or somehow try to suggest this is reenacted, somehow it killed everything. So in the end, it became only with reenactment.
Oh, that's really interesting. I wonder, could you say something a bit more about maybe why you particularly chose somebody that practiced Buto? Or maybe that people don't know, perhaps some people here don't know what that is exactly. Is there some significance to that in terms of that particular practice in relation to the reenactment?
when I work with actor, usually I don't like to use actor because they often have, if they come from theater, then they have specific kind of theatrical projection of the voice and certain, like some sort of a acting that come from the theater, or if they come from other things, they have. So I usually try to use someone who are good at improvising on the scene, but doesn't have a language, which is already built up on. And Buto dance is the avant-garde dance that happened in post-war Japan. But it started as a avant-garde, but I feel like nowadays it became some sort of tradition that have certain style and try to kind of keep the original thought of school of Buto. And so, but interesting thing is let's say in the traditional sense, people say that Western dance create one dance out of 10 dancers. Everyone's supposed to have a perfect line of it. Like it's about perfection and making into the idealistic body from individual bodies. And Buto dance is perhaps opposite because their way of teaching Buto is more like, let's say, how to move arms is like instead of describing this angle, they talk about, imagine if you have a stomach here, and then they try to interpret that kind of the language. And I kind of like that way because somehow the teaching of Buto already include miscommunication that everyone kind of understand in different way, and everyone kind of project their way of thinking into their movement. So there's no like a correct way of doing Buto. And I think that's why I chose Buto dancer. And during the filming session, I think it was like within the middle because I didn't let Toru dance at all. So Toru was really like wanted to dance, and he wanted to also show the Buto dance to my father. So during the session, we kind of booked community hall in the apartment complex, and then we made it quick set up the stage, and then Toru made some improvisation dance through experiencing through this filming session, and it was really beautiful dance. But I could see there was a Buto, definitely, and I didn't want to have that in the film. That's why, in a way, for me, always interesting to work with someone who has so much skill and experience, but at the same time, not let them do that, but try to do it other things and somehow seeing what happens in there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the time sense in the film, because it's a longer film, it's a slower film, and I wondered, what your thinking was in terms of that kind of time sense that you were creating, or you intending with this.
Yes, as perhaps some of people noticed, this structure is really similar to Chantal Ackerman's film, John Dillerman Apartment, the Bruxelles. I don't remember all the title, but basically that film portrayed single mom in Brussels, kind of doing the strict daily routine, and slowly that daily routine corrupts, and then in the end it's kind of build up to the suspense and then violence. That's a kind of quick way of describing it. And I really enjoyed the film, and it was really interesting experience of remembering what you have seen to see the difference. And I found it that was really also my experience through looking at my father's. Every time I meet him, I kind of remember how it was, and then kind of constantly updating. Oh, this place, this corner became much more difficult now. So the way the film was made, the narrative is made, is also kind of following my experience of looking at him. And I was interested in perhaps I could use this structure of careful observation and building suspense to create certain empathy or more understanding or accepting of body rather than end up in some sort of dramatic violence. So,
yeah, okay.
but it is interesting. It's 50 minutes film, and there's a 3 section. The first phase is the when he doesn't have any symptoms, so he do the normal routine of making protein and going to work out and so on. And second thing is second phase is when his daily routine start making problem with, because his symptom kind of increase. And third phase is more like he accepts the symptom, and so he had to create new way of using apartment, new way of making routine. And the time-wise, I think first phase is 10 minutes, and second phase is 8 minutes, and third one is 30 minutes. But from my experience, the first phase feels so slow because you really don't know why you're looking at this boring routine. But in the third phase, from my personal experience, things are so intense and intimate so that you kind of almost, it's long, but you kind of forget the time in a sense. And that's interesting. Yeah.
Okay. So I was wondering, this might seem a funny kind of question, but as an artist that's kind of existing across a number of different kind of countries and contexts, I wonder like how much the context of the first presentation of a work kind of shapes that work in terms of your thinking when you're invited to do something. You know, the difference between, you know, the first presentation of a work in Japan versus the first presentation of a work in Norway or something. How much does that kind of shape your decisions about, you know, the work in terms of that? I think we have that kind of sense that films that just are quite hermetic. They can kind of move around, but I guess, you know, you're working across quite distinctive kind of cultural context.
Yeah, it is. Before I start working more not exclusively, but more to the moving image, I always try to work with context. I still do when it comes to sound installation or certain installation. But after making moving image, I try to not think about context. Because I feel like somehow moving image have different lifetime than, let's say, commissioned installation with specific subject. So a false weight was first commissioned in the context of architecture. So, and then it was like a trilogy, like 3 artists making different work, and then I was the last one. And the first one was more kind of direct, a little bit more direct towards connection with architecture, and second was a bit more abstract, and mine didn't talk about anything about architecture. It talked almost only about body in architecture, but somehow it worked well in this context. But when I showed this film in Japan, then it was more about the body. So perhaps architecture kind of goes away and really directly the body. And all that goes before forget was first, it was commissioned by Volt, like artist curator run project, normative project in Bergen. So it was more like a new commission solo exhibition. So there was almost no context. I could just show whatever I was working and then it was shown in the Momentum Biennial in Norway, and then it has a bit more different context. And then went to Tokyo together with the false weight, and then it became its same combination that as you see in the Daiwa Foundation now. And I was curious how, yeah, it would change, because in Contemporary Museum Tokyo, even though my work were coupled, but also there was this other artist's work that connect with body and somehow moving image looking at the body or looking through body. But in Daiwa Foundation, there's more like clear juxtaposition between these two films. So yeah, I don't know which part is kind of highlighted in the film. I feel like all of my works often have a several angle to approach, and any context I put in somehow it's reacting different and highlights the different aspects.
Thank you. Thank you. And sorry, maybe another sort of difficult question. You know, you do work across other mediums apart from moving image, but that has become a bigger part of your practice, I guess. And you know, why do you work with moving image? What does it, you know, what place does it occupy within your practice? Why are you drawn to it?
I think maybe quick answer is maybe because I'm exposed to the moving image all over the place, the screens and, you know, mobile phone. Yeah. So I think if I live in different time, maybe I've been to painter.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're at an end now. So I just want to thank Daisuke for the conversation. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'd like to hand back.